Hi, this is Jack for iPokerVIP.net. Today is the fifth and final part of the concept video series, and we're going to be talking about blind versus blind play, which is something that's super important, and I don't think enough 6-max players really pay attention to it. But it's a spot where you can definitely increase your win rate quite considerably, and you're going to be costing yourself a lot of money if you're playing badly out of the blinds. So when we get to blind versus blind play, there's only two people left to act. There's already 1.5 big blinds in the pot to fight for. And if we're in a small blind, we're going to have half a big blind invested already. And if we're in a big blind, we're going to have one big blind invested already. Now, essentially what that means is when we're looking to play hands, we're looking to play hands which lose us less than if we folded. And if we're in the small blind, that means we're looking to play hands that lose us less than 0.5 big blinds a hand. And if we're playing in the big blind, we're looking to play hands that lose us less than one big blind a hand. Whilst you might think that folding is 0 EV, if you have ever played heads up and you've tried to play like really tight and just fold every hand and wait for a good one, you're going to know that you end up getting crushed. And the reason is that you're just folding away your blinds so much. So the EV of folding can't be 0 because the EV of folding can't be 0 because if you keep folding, you're just going to lose. So therefore, you're definitely losing money by folding, and it's not 0 EV. It's easy to think of 0 EV when you're in like other positions, when you're in under the gun, middle position, cutoff or button, because you don't have any money invested. And if you fold there, then yeah, folding is 0 EV because you don't have any money in the pot already. But when you're in the big blind or the small blind, and that money has already been taken from you, it's in the pot. It's worth fighting for. You need to fight for it, otherwise you're just going to be costing yourself tons of money. Now, because we have to play a lot of hands, the ranges are very, very wide. Like I said, we're playing hands which lose us less than folding. We're not playing hands that make us more than 0. We're playing hands that lose us less than one big blind in the big blind, and we're playing hands that lose us less than 0.5 in the small blind. So ranges are very, very wide, and it makes the play a lot different to regular 6-max. Play is kind of comparable to heads-up play, except the small blind in 6-max is out of position. So the big blind has a huge advantage. Even though he's got more money invested in the pot, he's going to be getting better pot odds to continue pre-flop, and he's also going to be in position for the whole hand. Additionally, he's also going to be closing the action. So there's a lot of you should be playing a lot of hands from the big blind, and depending on who's in the big blind, you should be playing a lot of hands in the small blind as well. But we're going to get into that in the next slide now. So our strategy from the small blind is going to be totally dependent on the big blind. A 3x open needs about 62.5% fold equity. So if our opponent has less than 20% VPIP overall, then he's probably the sort of person who's not going to be comfortable playing with 37.5% of hands, and therefore you can get away with opening tons and tons and tons versus him. I wouldn't open like 100% just because there's going to be some spots where you get like you flop like some showdown value, but it's kind of crappy and you get yourself into some tricky spots. But against people that are playing like 19-17, opening 60% from the small blind definitely won't be a leak, and the more that you feel comfortable opening, I'd say just definitely go ahead and do it until they start to show signs that they're adjusting. Because if we look in PokerStove, so this is some stuff that I was messing about with earlier, 37.5% of hands is all these ones in pink, or in purple, sorry, and I don't think someone playing like 19-17 or someone playing like 18-16 is going to be comfortable playing all of these hands at all. So you're definitely going to be showing a profit just by opening like tons and tons of hands versus him, because he's just going to be folding so much. Versus a good aggressive player, someone more playing like 24-20 or 22-20, or even someone like a laggy player playing like 30-26. You definitely don't want to be opening 60% because you're going to get crushed by someone who's a good player. You probably want to be opening more like 20-25%. And the reason is that they're going to be playing back too much. They're going to be free betting you. They're going to be calling and looking to make moves on flops. And it's just going to be really, really tricky playing a lot of hands from the small blind. So even though you'd be losing 0.5 big blinds by folding, against someone who's playing back at you a lot, then by raising to 3x with really marginal hands, you're just not going to be making money. You're going to be losing more than if you just flat out folded. Versus fish is definitely a good idea. Consider limping to complete. We're not going to have the fold equity we need pre-flop, because a lot of fish are going to be much more comfortable than nits playing like 37.5% of hands. In fact, they're probably going to call you with like 50 or 60% of hands quite happily. Additionally, they're not going to fold much on the flops. They're going to be looking to float, cool down light because they're fish and that's what they do. And since we're going to be out of position, we don't really want to bloat a pot with weak hands. However, a lot of fish aren't going to like try and isolate, or if you try and limp, like 5-6 suited and they see ace 4, they're not going to be raising you. They're just going to be checking and seeing a flop. So a lot of times with those, especially with those weak connectors or just like sort of weakish high card hands like Jack 9 offsuit, can be definitely a good idea to consider limping in versus a lot of fish, because you're getting a really good price pre-flop. You've only got to put in like 0.5 big blinds into a pot that's already 1.5 big blinds. So you're getting a great price to complete, and if they're not going to be raising much, so if they're pretty passive, then you're much better off taking that option than raising, having them call, and then having them float you on the flop, or doing like they're really like min raises and stuff. So can definitely be a good idea versus fish to limp in to complete it. Versus good aggro players, definitely a good idea to just open like 20-25% of hands. And versus someone who's a nit, someone who's playing less than 20% VPIP, just open like as much as you feel comfortable, but at least like 60% of hands, just because they're going to be folding so much pre-flop that you're automatically showing a profit. In terms of post-flop, we should expect to be floated a lot. So what this is going to mean that unless we're planning to barrel or check raise turn or do something like that, then we should be c-betting less often. If our plan is to c-bet and then give up in a lot of spots, that's going to be really, really bad, because our opponent's going to be quite comfortable floating the flop with like just a really wide range of hands, because he knows our range is wide. We should look to 2-barrel more often, because we need to get them off of their floats, and we can also go for thinner value when we're blind v blind, because of course ranges are so wide. So spots where you open in like middle position and the button calls, and on the turn you go for a bit of pot control by checking with your top pair good kicker. Those spots do apply, but with much weaker hands. So like middle pair good kicker is the spot to go for, like a bit of pot control on the turn. Any sort of top pair hand, definitely good enough to 2-barrel for value on almost every single board blind v blind, because his range is just so wide for calling on the flop. He's going to have loads of hands that he'd just never show up with if he called you on the button when you open from middle position. Additionally, we can look to check raise both for value or as a bluff, depending on our opponent, because our opponent's going to float a flop a lot to try and stab the turn. So for example, on like low drawy boards, he's obviously you're going to expect him to like raise all his sets. So when he does call, and the turn isn't a good 2-barrel card, you can definitely look to go for a check raise, both for value if you think that he's might bet call with like kind of crappy hands, or as a bluff if you think he's just going to stab and then fold. We'll get into that in some hand history examples, which we'll go into in a few minutes time. In general, our strategy from the big blind, it's going to be definitely dependent on our opponent, but versus a nit who isn't adjusting, isn't going to change his opening range based on how much we defend, then we want to play fairly tight. Reason is that he's going to have a tight range himself, so we don't want to be playing loads of really trashy hands, because even though we're folding sometimes and giving up one big blind, he's not going to be adjusting and taking advantage of that. If you've got an opponent who's a good reg, or like a fish, or just in general someone who's going to be opening a lot of hands from the small blind, you need to be playing back at them, because otherwise they're going to be exploiting you and making money. I think that is a good idea versus both good regs and fish to play in excess of 60% of hands, and I'll show you why in a minute. In general, we're going to be exploited. Like we said, 37.5% is minimum, but versus that range, he's got a lot of equity. If we pull up Poker Stove and we take in our 37.5% of hands and give our opponent something like, I don't know, ace 5 offsuit, say, we can see that he's close to a favourite versus our range there. He's got a lot of equity. Even with a hand like a trashy hand like 7-8 offsuit, he's got a lot of equity as well. If we see like it takes a while to complete, but we can see that he's going to have like 34-35% equity versus us, which is a lot of equity. And if we're defending the bare minimum, then he's actually going to still be making money, because he's going to make the best hand post flop a lot, and he's going to win the pot that way. So we need to be defending much wider than 37.5%. And I don't think that 60% of hands is unreasonable. If we look at 60% of hands, you can see that obviously some of these are a bit trashy, like this sort of 6-4 suited and 8-5 suited and stuff. But we're going to be free betting quite a bit wider for value from the big blind versus small blind open. We're going to be, well, certainly versus regulars, we're going to be comfortable free betting like 9s plus and ace queen plus for value, just because their range is going to be so wide and we need to fight back. And additionally, that means that we can free bet quite wide as a bluff. So a lot of these hands, if you're not comfortable flatting them, then just go ahead and free bet. But for the most part, it's fine to play like you know, an ace, any king, most queen X hands. Just because you've got high card hands, you've got good equity versus range. And anytime you flop top pair, you have very good equity versus range, just because his range is so wide. You need to get over the kind of mentality of playing versus a tight range, because if his range is like, usually you think of someone's range as being like, I don't know, top 20% of hands, you know, maybe they open from middle position, they open like 16%, and from the cutoff like 24%. And you think of them as having a, you know, fairly tight range. But from the small blind, most people are going to be, most people in general open too wide, and they're going to be opening like 35-40% of hands. And versus that range, there's just so much air in their range. There's just so many times when they miss the flop, or when they have just, there's so many like times where you flop top pair and they've got loads of middle pair combos that you can just make money quite easily. So yeah, I definitely don't think that 60% is too weak of a range to be defending versus both regs and fish. Obviously, I mean, you know, why would you ever fold versus a fish if he opens? The reason why, so we talked about the reason why of being we're being exploited, but we're being exploited if we don't defend enough. But also, like we said, his range is so wide, we're going to be able to steal the pot a lot post flop, either by floating or by bluff raising, or when he just check folds, or when we actually make a hand, we're going to be able to get some value because he's going to c bet, or you know, we're going to be able to bet the turn and he's going to cool down. We're free betting wider for value and as a bluff, so therefore we can throw in some of the weaker hands that we're still not comfortable calling with, like the 10-4 suited or whatever. We can just go ahead and free bet those. You know, if you like. It's obviously dependent on timing and whether you've been active lately, but you know, they can definitely be candidates for that. And then, like I said, we're going to be floating the flop, and we're going to bluff raise in some of the more drawy ones, and we're getting some good hand history examples to demonstrate that. Finally, I just wanted to leave you with a point that when we're in the big blind, we have position, we've got good pot odds, we're versus a wide range, and we've got deep stacks. Now, these are like the four main things that you really want in poker, right? The other one that we don't have is initiative, and I think that a lot of people put too much emphasis on the initiative, like they're not comfortable calling, they're comfortable either raising or folding. That's something that you really need to get out of your head, because initiative doesn't mean that much really. I mean, you can have the initiative, but when the flop comes, you see bet and I raise, well, suddenly I've got the initiative now, and you're the one that's in a tough spot. So you know, the initiative pre-flop just doesn't really matter. Like, you can go ahead and call. The important things are position and being against a wide range with deep stacks, and obviously good pot odds help as well. So how can we fold? You know, hands like king 3 or whatever might look kind of trashy, but they're really not when you're playing against a wide range. You're in position, you've got good pot odds, and you've got deep stacks. He doesn't know what cards you have. To an extent, like, you can almost represent what you want on a lot of boards. So this is definitely something to remember, and this when we look through the hand history examples that I'm going to show you now. So first we're going to look at some hands where I bluff raise the flop after calling a raise from the small blind when I'm in the big blind. Then we're going to look at some hands where I float the flop. And finally, we're going to look at some hands where I open from the small blind and do something to play back against the big blind, either two barreling or check raising turn. But because you're playing so many less hands from the small blind strategy isn't as important. Also, you've got less money invested from the small blind as well. The main important area of strategy is the big blind, so that's the one we're going to spend the most time looking at. Therefore, getting into the hand, we are going to see that the small blind opens, and this is a guy who opens 65% from the small blind. He has 68% fold to free bet, but he also four bets a lot. So he's the type of person that when I do free bet, although I'm going to get possibly enough folds when he's opening from the small blind, I want to be free betting hands that have a lot of value that I can feel comfortable shoving over four bet. Because if he's four betting like 1/5 of the time, then obviously 1/5 of 65 is like 65 times 0.18 is 11.7% of hands. So he's four betting like a lot, which means I'm assuming he's four betting pretty light for value. So I definitely want to be free betting with hands that I can feel comfortable shoving over four bet. This hand doesn't really make much sense to free bet, especially when I can profitably flat call. If we look at our equity, you know, this is like 60% of hands. He's actually got a bit more hands than this. If we throw king 3 suited in here, see that we definitely have a lot of equity to continue. You know, like, we're pretty much flipping versus his range, and we only need 30% to call based on the pot odds, and we're in position, and the stacks are very deep relative to the pot size. You know, considering we only got to put 3 more in with like 200 behind. Anyway, so flop comes 7-5-4 rainbow, so we don't flop much. We got gut shot and an overcard. he goes in and c-bets. If we look at his stats here, he's c-betting a lot, like 80%, and then he's also 2-barreling the turn a lot. So this isn't someone who I particularly want to float that much against, because I know I'm going to be facing a 2-barrel a lot on the turn. However, if we just look at Flopzilla quick and give him like 60% of hands, and then we clear the flop here, let's put in the flop, which is like 754 rainbow, doesn't matter on suits. We can see that, you know, he's only made top pair or better like 40% of the time. Now, considering he's c-betting so high, and on this type of flop as well, I guess that some of the showdown is like marginal showdown hands is actually checking, so that makes him a little bit more polarized. And so some of his top pair hands, you know, like the sort of 7, 8, 9, 7, those type of hands, I assume that he might, you know, check call on the flop. So that makes him a bit more polarized, and just because it's so hard for him to have a really big hand, makes him more weighted towards air, obviously. So this is a decent spot to go ahead and bluff raise. When he free bets, it's not like if he re-raises the flop, it's not like we're folding away much equity. And when he does call, it's usually going to be of a hand like, you know, pocket 9s, pocket 10s, and we've got 3 outs to the king and 4 outs to the gut shot with versus those hands. So we have a, you know, we have a decent amount of equity when called. When he re-raises, it's fine because, you know, we had like no equity in the hand anyway. Also, we have a lot of hands that we're legitimately raising for value on this flop. You know, we've got 6-8 suited, we've got 7-5 suited, we've got 4-5 suited, we've got all the sets. You know, we can also be raising hands like 5-6, 7-6, where we're sort of fine with raising because we've just got so much equity in the hand. So it's a spot where I think that I'm definitely going to get a lot of folds. It's really hard for him to continue if he's got a hand like, I don't know, ace-5 offsuit, because what's his plan on the turn? Additionally, if he's got any kind of gut shot like 10-8, he's probably just going to fold that as well. So it's a spot where I don't think I'm going to get played back at much. I think I'm going to get a lot of folds, and I'm repping a lot of hands for value. Additionally, there's 18 in the pot, and I'm only risking 22 on my flop raise. You can see I just made it a little bit smaller than 3x. Don't think his continuing range changes whether I make it like 22 or whether I make it like 26. So I might as well just make it a bit smaller, and therefore it needs less fold equity. And he does go ahead and fold. So you can see that I think that this is definitely a good spot to bluff raise, especially when we're, you know, there's 18 in the pot, we're making it 22, so we need him to fold just over half the time, and really it's really hard for him to hit this flop. It's really easy for us to hit this flop. He's c-betting a lot, so he's just going to have to fold a lot. And yeah, I think that this was a good spot to bluff raise. It's definitely one of the spots that you want to be attacking when you call raises from the big blind versus small blind open. With these kind of low middling flops versus people who c-bet a lot, they're definitely really good boards to attack because it's just so hard for him to continue. Next hand I wanted to look at is another hand where, you know, we call from the big blind and we're going to bluff raise the flop. Flop comes 10-6-5. We're against this player who opens like 70% from the small blind. It's a small sample, so it probably isn't opening this much in reality, but you know, you can see that he's open from like every position, seems pretty loose. So he's either been catching a monstrous hot run of cards, or he's just quite a loose player in general. Additionally, his c-bet is like 94%, which is obviously just massive, and his turn c-bet is quite high too. Although it's only over a small sample, basically this guy just seems ridiculously aggro. So when he c-bets this flop here, I don't particularly want to flat call because I know I'm going to be facing 2-barrel so much on the turn that I'm not going to be able to show a profit by floating and planning to take it away. So my better option is, of course, to go ahead and bluff raise. The question is obviously whether this is a good time to do it. Now, if we bring up Flopzilla, maybe he isn't opening, you know, 70%. That's a small sample, but he's probably opening somewhere more like 50, you know, like 50% or whatever. Even if you give him a bit of a smaller range. Of course, if you give him 70%, then his range is just even weaker. But if we look at 10-5-2, you know, if we look at this 10-5-2 flop, you can see that only 25% of his range makes top pair or better, or a big draw. So this is a spot where against someone who's just c-betting pretty much 100%, a small bluff raise is just going to show such a huge profit. Because when I make it 22 again, you know, there was 20 in the pot this time, sorry. Because he made it 6 pre instead of 5. So now I've raised it to 22. I only need like just over 50% fold equity, and we can see that only 25% of his range on this flop makes top pair or better. So it's going to be really, really hard for him to continue unless he's happy to bet call with like pocket 8s on the flop. And I think that with no history, which we didn't have at this point, he's just going to fold those hands. Again, there's a lot of hands that I'm legitimately raising for value here. You know, 10s tens if I didn't re-raise them pre-flop, 10-6 suited, 10-5 suited, 6-5, pocket sixes, pocket fives, big flush draws, big combo draws. There's a lot of legitimate hands that I'm raising for value. Even hands like ace 10, king 10 could raise here on occasion for sure. Ace 10 more likely than king 10, but essentially there's a lot of value hands that I'm repping by raising this flop, and in general it's just so hard for him to be able to continue, because when he's got a wide range and he's c-betting a lot, it's just really hard for him to hit. He goes ahead and folds. Finally, we're going to look at a hand where Bluff raised the flop in a bad spot, and we'll talk about why, which is obviously important. These have both been good spots because we're repping a lot of value hands, and we're against someone whose range is really wide and who c-bets a lot. In the next example, we'll see an example where that's not the case, and I'll make a bad bluff raise. Okay, so in this hand we call a raise from the big blind with ace 7 offsuit, which again is totally standard versus just about anyone. Flop comes 9-8-3 two-tone, and our opponent goes ahead and c-bets. This is a pretty good player, Zoli, 21. Used to play with him on full tilt actually before it went down. And you can see that he's opening from the small blind 33%, so it's quite a bit tighter than the other example, or the other two examples. And then he's only c-betting 54%. So again, he's the type of player who isn't just mindlessly c-betting; he's only c-betting his really good hands, or he's not only c-betting his really good hands, but he's c-betting a much stronger range than the other players. And so, especially on this type of flop texture, I think that he's probably the type of player who, if he's just got dry over cards like, I don't know, king queen off with no hearts, he's just going to go ahead and check fold. Whereas the other two players, I think, would have just gone ahead and c-bet, because that's the way they play. So I think that this guy has a much stronger range than in the other example, and I'm not sure that he's necessarily going to fold all that much to a raise here. Even though I only need like 50% fold equity, I'm not sure that I necessarily get that. As well, I've got obviously ace high, I've got backdoor hearts, and I've got backdoor straight draws. So there's a lot of turn cards that I can continue on if I do call here. And he does two barrel the turn. If he two barrels on a heart, I can be very comfortable calling again. If he two barrels on a 6 or a 10, I can look to call again. Possibly not on a 10, but probably on a 6, I'd peel again. So I think that this is more of a good spot to go ahead and float rather than raise, because we've got a decent amount of backdoor equity. If he does check the turn, then we're going to be able to steal it anyway. His turn barrel is relatively high, but that's only over a small sample, and I think based on his other stats, he's probably not just going to be mindlessly two barreling like the other players seem to be doing. He doesn't seem anywhere near as aggro as they are. But basically, I think that because his range is quite a bit tighter pre-flop, and because his c-betting range is so much stronger, because his c-bet is so much lower than the other players, that his range is going to be a bit too strong on this flop, and I'll go ahead and bluff raise. I'll get called, and then the turn is a 2, and obviously it's like the terrible barrel card. I figured that if I raised the flop and he called, I could barrel on like a 6 or a 10 or a heart, but in general I don't think I'm going to get enough folds, and I think that is a profitable spot to float, so I can just go ahead and call the flop and play a turn rather than raise the flop, because even though he's going to have like a strong range, it's only a strong range relative to the fact we're playing blind versus blind. So if he's c-betting, say, like, I don't know, 10-9, and the turn is like a 5 of hearts, I think that puts him in a very tricky spot. And even though that's quite a strong hand on the flop, 10-9, he's definitely not folding it to a raise. I think that once like a 5 of heart turn rolls off or something, he's got to definitely check and possibly fold, possibly check call, and then check decide on the river. But anyway, there's definitely some turns where I can take it away from him on, and so I think that floating in this spot would be a lot better than bluff raising. So now I'm going to move into some spots where I'll float the flop and look to try and win it on the turn and river, which is what I should have done here. But this is an example of when not to bluff raise. Okay, so this is the first spot I wanted to talk about with regards to floating, blind versus blind anyway. And we get a situation where the small blind opens and we defend queen 9 off, which is pretty standard, of course. You can see that he opens, sorry, he opens 60% blind versus blind, which is massive. He c-bets like 76%, then gives up, or at least only 2 barrels to turn, 40%. So it's giving up a lot on the turn, c-betting a lot and then giving up, basically. So on a king 6-2 flop, basically I think he's going to be c-betting a lot, but then I think when I call here, there's so many king x hands in my range that if the turn doesn't change the board, he's just going to check fold. If he doesn't have a king himself, or at least like nines, tens, jacks, queens, I think he's just going to fold, check fold. On like a blank. If the turn is like a ace or queen, jack, 10, then there's a chance he's going to fire second barrel, just because there's going to be obviously a lot of hands in his range that have gut shots and stuff, and he'd be able to get me off of floats, he'd be able to get me off of 7s, 8s, 9s. But I think that in general there's going to be way more cards where he's just going to check and fold. And considering the price I'm getting, obviously 2.3 to 1, it's definitely a good spot to float. Regarding bluff raising, if I was to raise here, there's not a ton of hands that I'm repping because the board's so disconnected. There's not many 2 pairs in my range at all, and there's obviously 2s and 6s, but that's a small range. King 6, king 2, but I don't even know if he's necessarily putting me on that when I call pre-flop. I don't think he necessarily thinks I've got that in my range. So it's a spot where obviously I'm not repping much by raising. So even though he's c-betting a lot, I don't even know if I get the required fold equity, because there's a chance that he might put in like a small 3-bet bluff, or there's a chance that he might call or 3-bet a bit lighter for value. But obviously, like I said, we're floating. I think that if the turn is whatever, like a 7, I think he's just going to check and fold. I don't think he's going to play too tough on many turns. And obviously there's a lot of turns that give me quite a good amount of equity. Any diamond obviously gives me a good hand to semi-bluff with if he checks the turn, because even if he has a hand like king jack and he decides to check call on like a 4 of diamonds turn, I've got outs to make. I've got outs to make it a flush. If the turn is like a 10 or a jack, then gives me a gut shot. Turns a queen or a 9, it gives me a pair, which gives me quite a strong hand versus range. Doesn't give me necessarily a strong hand if he 2-barrels those cards, but gives me a strong hand versus range overall. And in general, I mean, the majority of the reason comes from the fact that he's just going to be check folding the turn so much on this type of board, because like I said, once I call this flop, there's so many king X hands in my range. He should definitely be he should be reasonably expecting me to defend like king 8 plus, king 8 offsuit plus to a small blind raise. Even though I'll be defending more kings than that, I think that he'd definitely be expecting me to defend that as a bare minimum. So when I do call on this flop, there's like tons of combos of king X in my range. Like I said, I think he's just going to check fold, and that's exactly what he does. Goes ahead and checks folds, and I take down the pot. So this is the second example that I wanted to show you, and it's going to be a situation where quite tight player opens from the small blind, but he's got like 37% open from the small blind anyway, even though he's playing 19-15 overall. Even if his small blind open was like 20-25%, this would obviously be a defender of ace jack. Against 37%, it's obviously mandatory. Flop comes queen 7-4, and even though this guy's got 60% c-bet, usually what that means is his c-bet's range is going to be fairly polarized, and so a lot of his marginal showdown hands he's just going to check, and he's going to c-bet with his really strong hands and his really weak ones. Obviously on this type of board it's a lot easier for him to have a lot of weak hands than a lot of strong ones, especially with 37% open, and because it's dry, queen 7-4, there's not really any draws there. I expect him to just c-bet like almost all of his air on this board. If he opens with like ace 8 offsuit, I think he's just going to fire a c-bet. So I could float, I could bluff raise. This isn't a very good flop for bluff raising, just because I wouldn't necessarily want to value raise any of my sets or my 2 pairs. Additionally, there's not that many sets or 2 pairs possible, because I'm obviously 3-betting queens pre-flop. There's not a ton of 2 pairs available, so it's a spot where I'm not really repping much by raising, so it makes much more sense to float. In general, I mean, I'm actually going to probably have a lot of equity versus range anyway, especially considering I only need 29% to call. But I think that this is a really mandatory flop float on this type of board, and I'd float with a lot of worse hands than ace jack. Anything with like backdoor straight draws, backdoor diamond draws. And the reason is because I think that he's going to fire one with all his air, and then he's just going to give up, because when I call here, as opposed to raising when I call, I represent so many hands like, lots of 7x hands, lots of queen x hands, pocket 8s, those type of, mid pair hands that didn't 3-bet pre-flop, and they're definitely going to call the flop. So unless the turn is a Broadway, I don't think he's going to fire a second barrel unless he's got it, and therefore he's just going to check fold the turn a lot. Additionally, on like a 10 or a king, I turn a lot of equity. or turn a bit of equity anyway. On an ace, obviously, I turn a lot of equity versus his range, and on a jack, I turn quite a lot of equity versus his range as well. But I think that in the majority of the time, he's just going to check fold the turn if it's a blank. And obviously, when I do hit, I make some money, and it gives me some legitimate outs, and it also gives me some implied odds when I do hit, because if the turn's an ace and he's got like king queen, he's certainly going to put a decent amount of money in, because it's blind v blind, and he's still doing very well versus my range overall with king queen on an ace turn. Anyway, the turn comes at 10 and he decides to check, and I just assume he's given up. I do expect him to two barrel this a lot, if with any draw at least, but when he does check, I think mostly he's just giving up. Makes far more sense for him to just bet the turn again for value than check with the intentional check call in, because there's so many hands in my range that can call a bet but might check back if checked to. For example, like weak queens or like 7-8, 7-9, those type of hands might probably call again on the turn, but will just check behind if checked to. So I think that most of the time he's just check folding. And I could have bet a bit smaller than this. I could have bet like 18, and probably a mistake on my part to bet this big, because I don't think it's necessary. Because when he checks, he's usually decided what he's doing. He's usually decided whether he's check folding or check calling. So it's not too important what my bet size is, and so therefore it's better for me to bet small because it gives me a better price on my bluff. This video has gone on a little bit longer than I was hoping for, so I'm going to skip to just showing you a couple of hands where I was small blind and I raised. I think that you obviously should get the idea about floating from the previous concept video. There's not too much to talk about there. The main thing was the bluff raising element, which we talked about earlier. And obviously against someone who c-bets and then two barrels a lot, you want to bluff raise a lot more. If they're the type of player who c-bets and then gives up a lot on the turn, usually becomes a better idea to float. And the reason comes from the maths that we talked about in a couple of the videos in this series, which I won't go over. But basically, obviously, if they're just playing very straightforwardly on the turn, then you risk a lot less by just floating the flop. So on this type of board versus this type of player, I think that he's going to play very straightforwardly on the turn, so it makes more sense to float. Similarly, on the previous board where it was like a king-high board against a player who had a high c-bet and a low turn barrel, made a lot more sense to float there than bluff raise, whereas the players we saw earlier in the examples I showed you, they had a high c-bet, but they also had a very high turn barrel. So it makes a lot more sense to go ahead and bluff raise the flop if you want to make a move than float against those players, because they're just going to be firing a second barrel so much that it's going to be really hard for you to win the pot when you just call. So this is the hand I wanted to show you about two barrel the turn, not so much as counter and floats actually. This is a good hand to demonstrate that we want to be going for thinner value. So we're going to go ahead and raise blind versus blind here in a 1-2 game. And we get called by this player who's playing quite tight, 19-15. And we see a flop of Jack 4-7, two tones. So we're obviously very happy with our hand. We want to make a continuation bet to get some value. He goes ahead and calls. And I think on this flop, it's pretty unlikely that he'd be calling with a set. So I think that when he does call, his range is generally pretty weak, and wait towards some draws, wait towards some marginal showdown hands. So when the queen comes on the turn, if this was in regular 6-max, so if I was like middle position against Burton, I'd definitely consider checking this hand, because obviously it's not a hand that I want to be building a big pot with. Now that the queen's come, it's obviously not a good card for me, because a lot of his range is going to be like ace jack, queen jack. But blind versus blind, so much of his range is going to be like jack 9, jack 8, 7-8, pocket 8s, pocket 6s, 7-6, ace 7. There's so many hands that I'm just obviously absolutely crushing on the turn that I just have to keep betting for value. It's a turn that he'd expect me to two barrel with all of my air, and it's a turn that I would two barrel with a lot of my air. So therefore, it's definitely a turn that I should go ahead and bet for value, because I think if he's got any jack, he's not folded. And to be honest, I doubt he's going to fold a 7 on this turn, just because by the time I bet, like if I bet 30 here, he needs 30% to continue. And if you think about my range, he's definitely got that with hands like 7-8. So it's quite easy peel on the turn with a hand like 7-8 for him. But yeah, this to illustrate, being able to value bet. I think some people would go ahead and check this hand on the turn, which is definitely a mistake when you think about your overall range, and also when you think about his range. It's quite hard for you to be beaten here, just because his pre-flop range is going to be, it's not going to be so wide, because obviously he's 19-15, but it's going to be a decent amount of hands, and he's definitely going to defend like jack 8 suited, jack 9 off, jack 10 off. So you're definitely beating a lot of hands in his range, and also just because he flat called on the flop. Unless he's got ace queen or queen jack specifically, then I don't think you're going to be beat on this turn ever. Okay, so this is the final hand I wanted to show you. we open from the small blind with Jack 9 off, and we've got a player in the big blind playing 25-22. I think that this is quite a loose open actually. I think I'd rather see myself just fold this hand, but in this time I went ahead and opened it. But yeah, like I said, I do wish I'd folded pre-flop. Anyway, the flop comes 10-8-4 rainbow, and we go ahead and c-bet. Obviously goes without saying, and he goes ahead and calls. Turns a 2, so it's a complete blank. But if we think about his range for calling on the flop, he's definitely going to be floating with any gut shot, and he's definitely going to be floating with any pair. And if his fold to steal isn't very high, his big blind fold to steal was only like 63. It's free betted a lot, 25%, but in this spot, I think that he's just going to be. I think that he's obviously just flat calling a lot as well in this spot. So I think that when we get to the turn, he's going to have loads of weak showdown hands, loads of gut shots, some ace high hands. I doubt he's folding like king queen, ace jack, those type of hands on the flop. But I think that when I two barrel this turn, because it's not a turn that he's going to expect me to two barrel like that much, I think that he's definitely going to fold anything that doesn't have a pair, which makes up a lot of hands. And he might even fold a hand like 4-5 or like 7-8. He might fold that as well on the turn. Additionally, when I do get called again on the turn, I still have a decent amount of equity because obviously I have my open ender and I have an overcard. But it's just a spot where this is like you're gonna get floated a lot on this type of board, like dry flops where there's lots of gut shots, lots of reasons for people to call, lots of reasons for people to call with overcards, especially if they've got backdoor flush draw. So it's a spot where you're going to get floated a lot, and when a blank comes off like this, is definitely a good spot to go ahead and two barrel, because it's not like when you open middle position and they call on the button, because in that spot they're going to have a lot of hands with showdown value, or a lot of like, you know, fairly strong hands. They're going to be slow playing a decent amount with like 4s, 8s, 10s. They're going to be having some overpairs in their range. They're going to have strong top pair hands in their range. They're not going to have necessarily all of the gut shot hands, because they're not going to call pre-flop when you open like under the gun. They're not going to call on the button with like 9-7, or, you know, they might not even call with like 6-7 suited. They might decide to free bet or fold it. But blind v blind, they're going to have all those hands in their range. They're going to have loads of overcard hands. They're going to have loads of gut shots. They're going to have loads of weak showdown hands. They're going to have like ace-4, 7-8, 6-8 suited. You know, all of those type of hands. And basically, because they've got such a weak range, you have to be two barreling a lot more. You could go ahead and, you know, check raise this turn, but I think that in general, I think that two barreling is probably going to be better when you don't know much about their tendencies. If you know that he's the type of player who's just going to stab the turn all the time and then just like fold anything except two pair or set when you check raise, probably a good idea to go ahead and check raise as like a semi bluff with Jack 9 here. But I don't really know much about his post flop tendencies, so I just decided to go ahead and two barrel. And he goes ahead and folds. You don't need to make it particularly big, because you're not trying to fold out like his 10x hands. You're just trying to fold out his really weak showdown value, or his gut shots / overcard floats and stuff. So usually that card wouldn't be a good two barrel card, because obviously it helps your opponent's range. You know, if he wasn't scared on the flop, he's not going to be scared by that turn card. But the fact is that because it's blind v blind, it's just going to be calling so much with like gut shots, overcards, etc., that you're going to get more than enough folds on this type of turn card to justify it. So that wraps up this video. I hope that you've learnt some cool stuff about playing blind versus blind. I hope it's opened your eyes to the fact that you've got to play more hands, and that it's quite easy to play a lot of hands profitably. I hope that you've enjoyed the series. I hope that you've learned a lot from it. Definitely, if you have any questions, suggestions, comments in general, then just leave them in, like, I'm sure there'll be a comment section or a way to message me or get to me, even if it involves going through like the site admin people. So definitely, if you have any questions, then do that. I've really enjoyed making these videos. I hope you've learned a lot for them. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. This has been Jack for ipokervip.net. Take care and good luck at the tables.